So we have three presentations today, all related in greater or lesser degrees to the metaphysics of identity. So first we have Nikki's going to present on Schecthman's notion of empathic access. So we're going to present papers, and then there'll be a 15-minute discussion period, question period, and then we can move on to the next one. Okay, so here's Nikki.
Okay, so what I'm going to present right now is just called the hated past, and it's more about this one particular notion Schecthman has about empathic access, and we'll get to that, what it actually means. So, in the course of a lifetime, multiple changes in personality, character, and situation are commonplace. We can look fondly on a past, teenage antics, or childhood memories with friends over drinks. Sometimes we recognize ourselves as wholly changed, but still, in a manner of speaking, we are the same person we once were. We may review old photos with happy embarrassment of episodes that were long forgotten, but I may no longer be exactly the same, but who I was still maintains a space in who I consider myself to be today. I recognize the person in these photos and memories as myself. There are times, however, when thinking about the past is much more difficult. Sometimes when thinking of our past tests this sort of notion of self-recognition, who we once were is alien and unfamiliar. Such might be the case when a religious convert views her past. She sees herself in every respect distinct from the person she is now. Equally, an elderly criminal might view the sordid actions of his youth with profound disdain. In either case, who they were is wholly different from who they are now. It would seem only metaphorical to claim that they are now different people. For the rehabilitated criminal, we might say that he's become a different person, but there is in some sense in which we clearly do not mean it. A change is only remarkable because he also remains the same person. Not only does his present character seem incongruent with his past self, but also if his story was mentioned from his past, he might respond, "That is not me anymore." He no longer identifies with the past, consequently driving a wedge between his former and present self. Is the reformed criminal correct? Are these memories of not just a different time, but a different person altogether? Essentially, can such a lack of self-recognition amount to a new identity? From early conceptions of personal identity theory, the prospect of two or more distinct identities within the same life has remained an intriguing possibility. Amnesia, body-switching experiments, and brain transplants have all been invoked to support an idea of a new self. Recently, however, Schecthman has utilized a more subtle mechanism to give us a distinct identity, namely affective discontinuity, as seen in cases of profound shame, mortification, and in these cases we may actually be able to warrant a claim to a new self. For Schecthman, whether or not one can be considered the same person depends on whether he conceives himself and the events of his past in terms of a narrative. She calls this the narrative self-constitution view. On this account, persons continue and remain the same through a continuing self-told story. It is, however, more than an autobiography. It is an active and dynamic way of experiencing and approaching the world that provides a limit on who the person is. How we conceive of the past determines the limits of who we are. So, and in this case, viewing the past with profound sense of shame and mortification provide central cases of affective discontinuity that signals the emergence of a new identity. In this presentation, it is this claim I want to challenge. Specifically, I want to ask two different questions. First is more of a normative one. We can ask, should affective distance mark a change of identity? And perhaps more importantly, how should this affect our notions of responsibility? For the second question, it's a little more descriptive. Does affective discontinuity provide a point of separation? Is it true that the mortified person can be considered wholly distinct? In the end, I would hope to answer no to both questions. But before we get on to what empathic access is, it's good to make some clarifications on Schecthman's account and some of the distinctions she makes. One of the first distinctions we need to make is between the notions of re-identification and characterization, whereas Schecthman is primarily concerned with the latter. Traditionally, questions of personal identity theory have centered on whether there is a relation of sameness between persons at earlier and later times. This is the re-identification question, as it asks, what is the relation that every object bears to itself and nothing else? Schecthman argues that these questions have been usually conflated with another distinct line of inquiry. These concern characterization. Such questions ask what characteristics, what character traits, motivations, values, attachments, commitments, and so on make the particular person who they are. Namely, the re-identification question asks, what makes a characteristic part of a person's history? While the characterization question asks, what makes it truly hers? Characterization is more about attribution and over legitimate identification, where for Schecthman, identification can go for more bodily criterion. So when changes occurred due to affective discontinuity, we are led not to ask of one's history, but whether one's past remains one's own, and it is this sort of question that needs to be asked when determining the limits of what Schecthman calls the 4 features. And these are the main features we want to ask when we're considering personal identity, and they involve survival, self-interested concern, and moral responsibility. So in terms of moral responsibility in particular, history has provided multiple examples of affective breaks with the past to ones that on the face of it seem to warrant weaker attributions of responsibility. In this case, changes of character are not always trivial signs of maturation, as many stories of rehabilitation contain notions of affective distance and self-conception that seemingly provide the intuitive pull for appeals for clemency in stories of reformation. To the extent to which person is rehabilitated is not contained by determining whether the action occurred in one's history, but the degree to which the action is attributable to the person now. If we are asked a re-identification, there's little question of whether a former criminal has committed the crime. Characterization, however, is more complicated than asking if he was the one to do this. As people change and move through life, we're given biological continuity, satisfying re-identification, which what seems to be an effective discontinuity with the past episodes that are unowned and alienated from the present self, thereby disrupting this question of characterization. Okay, so I just want to give a really quick account of what this narrative self-constitution view involves. So to account for the sense of continued personal attribution given by the characterization question, Schecthman posits the narrative self-constitution view. On this account, persons create an identity by forming an autobiographical narrative of his or her life. A person can be characterized as the same when there's a coherent narrative in place to unite the disparate elements of one's conscious experience. We're not looking for a relation of similarity here, but more concerned about how the past and anticipated future can inflect the present. Narratives not only describe a life, but help to produce a distinct phenomenological experience in what it means to live that life. That is, we perceive our lives not as a series of incidents, but as part of an ongoing narrative where our experienced past and anticipated future conditions are woven into our present context. So self-narrative functions as organizing principles, integrating experience, enabling us to make sense of our past, future, and even the world we inhabit. Thus, to have a narrative for Schecthman is to experience events of one's life as interpreted through one's own life story and to feel the effect that follows upon doing so. The narrative self-conception is the lens through which our conscious experience is shaped in a way that provides a distinct subjectivity that is attributable to a particular person. So what does this actually mean? I've probably just said a whole mouthful, and it's probably not even clear what this narrative self-constitution view means. So I think maybe an analogy might be actually helpful, and this is one Schecthman himself uses. So narratives are self-conceptions that change one's subjectivity in the present to create, as Schecthman puts it, a temporally extended experiencing subject who is conceptually prior to experience. Thus, the narrative conception views the composition of person, as Schecthman argues, like a stew or a soup. It alters current experience as each ingredient contributes to the flavor of the whole, and it itself is altered by being simmered together with others. So experiences as the various ingredients within the narrative soup give a certain taste and texture to the experience present. Importantly, like a soup that requires each ingredient to give a particular taste, the narrative cannot be isolated into various parts or lose some of its parts of the narrative thread without feeling a loss of the whole. So essentially, how the narrative is constructed and what experience are included will then produce a particular subject of the experience, which can be subtly altered when there are shifts in the narrative and when certain ingredients are lost. Okay. So, we're talking about maintaining this taste. Okay. So importantly, to maintain the taste of the narrative soup, there's one particular ingredient central to the extension of the particular subject of experience. It is a specific kind of effective memory connection Schecthman calls empathic access. Okay. So as Schecthman states, to have empathic access is not an exact recreation of past emotions, thoughts, and feelings, nor an ability to call them up from a first-person perspective. What is needed is this ability plus a fundamental sympathy for these states which are called in this way. So accordingly, empathic access is a particular type of memory connection, is not dry and descriptive, but deeply embedded with our emotional states, thereby allowing us to experience underlying emotions and the thoughts felt during the remembered event. Okay, the subject of experience, to be the same subject of experience and thereby the same soup, requires sympathy for the past if the behavioral and affective repertoire is to be generally the same. So the soup needs the same ingredients, and any alteration of what sorts of ingredients they are is going to alter the soup altogether. So how does this work? So the narrative self-constitution, as the narrative self-constitution view goes, persons as narrators have a consciousness that extends over time, which bestows a distinct phenomenological life. The loss or retention of empathic access becomes the main indication to how ordinary maturation can be distinguished by a kind of identity loss. It provides a limit to how much we can change the ingredients. Right? So to articulate a continuing identity in Schecthman's terms, a distinction needs to be made between changes that are identity threatening and those that can be more benign. Fortunately, Schecthman provides a couple of examples that make this notion clear. Schecthman uses the example of a former party girl that turned a sober matron for whom the limits of identity could be somewhat compromised. So she was once guided by a party-going lifestyle, the sober matron finds herself in the present to be a calm wife and mother. She can remember the past wants, desires, and motives of the former party girl she was, but chooses not to act on those same sorts of desires in the present. She calls this woman the sober matron. One question we can ask is whether the wild child of her past has indeed survived in her embodiment as a mother. To answer this, there's a couple of ways this change can be cashed out depending on how the mother conceives of the past. So how much of those sort of former ingredients are still there? So first we have two extremes here. First is the mortified matron. Like the sober matron, this individual has access to both memory and emotions of past events. However, unlike the sober matron, these memories are now connected to shame and disgust. Like a religious convert trying to purge herself of sinful desires, the behavioral and psychological states by which these desires and events are remembered significantly differ than what she had at the time. If the mortified matron to have an effective connection to this past self, where she feels and understands the emotion she once had, we would be more inclined to say that she remains the same person. To this extent, we can also picture an alternative matron, less antagonistic to her former desires. This somewhat less serious matron has not lost access to her past phenomenology, and she's only placed it in a broader context, which causes her to make different choices. To have empathic access to one's former self is to retain the phenomenological and behavioral connection we desire in the present. This does not necessarily need to materialize in the exact same sort of behavior as before. So long as the past sympathies are given some weight, the less serious matron may feel a need to justify her actions when she deviates from past ideals. As Schecthman explains, her old impulses act as a check on the new, making her consider carefully her motives, or drawing her to a more balanced picture. In this sense, changes in behavior may simply reflect a more considered decision. There is no profound alienation, but what can only be described as ordinary maturation. The less serious matron portrays a picture of growth and expansion of the self, where the mortified matron demonstrates an effective discontinuity, that points to a subtle loss of identity. When former desires are rejected through affective distance, we're no longer looking at the result of an expansion of beliefs, values, desires, and goals, as seen in ordinary maturation, but a replacement. Okay, so far, what we have here is Schecthman's account of the narrative identity answers the characterization question by positing a distinct subject of experience. Who a person remains to be is determined by the extent of the narrative. In this case, identity is not only is preserved so long as the former objectives are still given some weight through empathic consideration and influence in current experience. The former motives, thoughts, and desires that of those who view their past in the same manner as the mortified matron do not experience the world as inflected by these aspects of the past, but thoroughly reject them. For Schecthman, they are different people. However, before I get onto my argument, there's one more distinction that Schecthman makes that I think would be helpful to understand. So one more distinction. For Schecthman, when we reject the past in a manner like the mortified matron, the past is not entirely banished from our narrative. It has just been relegated to a different kind of narrative. Right? There can be aspects of our past experience that remain attributable to the person that are not deeply owned by that present person. She differentiates between narrative of persons and narratives of selves, each of which are distinguished by degrees of attribution through two senses of ownership, which I will just call tacit and self-ownership just for clarity. So narratives of persons require only an implicit chronicling of past events, and you need to acknowledge the import of the present, but these experiences don't need to be deeply owned by the self. As she says, it's an explanatory account of how actions and events lead to other actions and events, how we come to be in the position we're in, and what that position is likely to lead. A narrative of persons is attributable to the present person through a tacit sense of ownership. Someone assumes the past is one's own and accepts responsibility only insofar as obligations are recognized and not owned. Just as if I signed a lease to a house, I can recognize that obligation, but I don't need to identify with the person who signed that lease. Okay, so narratives of selves, by contrast, require a stronger sense of ownership for the past states. Experiences appropriate to the narrative selves do more than constrain future options as a cognitive acknowledgement of the significance of past actions, but functions in a way of conditioning experience, as she says, in the strongest sense. A past action is only brought under the self-narrative when the action is connected through empathic access, and in consequence identified by the agent as one's own. Persons can take ownership of the past in a way that is experienced by the present self, in a sense I call self-ownership. For an action to be experienced, action or experience to belong to the self, as she says, I do need to identify it with it, or care about it, or take interest in it. So in this case, the profound disgust experienced by the mortified matron can distinguish a new self-narrative emerging, but not necessarily a distinct person narrative. It is specifically the continuing self-narrative that answers the characterization question in determining who the person is, while a narrative of person really just accounts for what somebody has done. Okay, so let's get back to those initial questions. So there's Schecthman's picture in a really rough and ready nutshell. So in what follows, I will consider Schecthman's empathic division with regards to these two initial questions in mind. So the first one, if we remember, is should affective distance mark a change of identity? And second, does affective discontinuity provide a clear point of separation between persons? I would answer no to both of these questions by specifically looking at responsibility and rehabilitation. What I want to say in cases of affective distance is that the reformed yet ashamed criminal should not view his past in terms of actions of a different self, as Schecthman would argue, but actions in which he's deeply implicated. The rehabilitated offender remains connected to the past through the influence of shame and negative self-evaluations by conditioning their experience of the self in the present. If responsibility attaches to the persisting subject of experience, that negative past should frame and inform how one approaches the world, whereby relegating the past to a person narrative may be seen as a way to avoid responsibility known to be one's own. Right? Okay. So, should the effective distance mark a change of identity? The narrative self-constitution view accounts for responsibility in a specific manner. It concentrates on identity conditions to hold somebody responsible and properly attribute an action to them. Essentially, we're giving a continuing subject to which responsibility can attach. However, it is not clear that this account of identity can answer all questions concerning continued responsibility. According to Bernard Williams, there's another aspect of responsibility which comes out if we start on the question not from the response of the public or the state or the neighbors or damaged parties, demands of the agent, but sorry, I just got a little muddled there. But what the agent demands of himself. Responsibility construed in the narrative of persons can be seen as responding to the demands of others and holding oneself liable, while responsibility inherent in the narrative itself should be understood as different. So, namely, as a person, you can be held responsible by taking a sort of third-person perspective of yourself. You can hold yourself responsible for your actions and respond appropriately. As a self, however, we can understand responsibility as a matter of whether you have taken responsibility for your actions in both your attitude and incorporated these aspects into your self-conception. So one problem, if we have these two different notions of responsibility, is that if a negative and shameful past is primarily contained within a narrative of persons, it's difficult to see how one maintains the ability to take responsibility in Williams' first personal sense. The account of persons is situated as an explanatory account external to the agent, whereas taking responsibility for a past action seems to necessarily involve more than a tacit sense of ownership. Actions that cause fear, shame, and regret, once excluded from my self-narrative, have no other place other than within account of persons that lacks both self-ownership and implication. Without self-ownership and implication, the narrative persons seems to be a purely causal account of one's past. Yet under a causal explanation, the purpose behind one's actions is altered. The past is understood as something that's happened, as opposed to something I caused. In a quote borrowed from Christina Korsgaard, to call a movement a twitch or a slip is at once to deny that action and to assign it to some part of yourself that is less than the whole. The twitch to your eyebrow, or the slip more problematically to your tongue. Like calling an erroneous statement the slip of the tongue. This positions the action as something that happened without your intent. By relegating a negative past in the same way to a person's history in cases of affective discontinuity, the estranged individual no longer sees the past as something in which they are deeply implicated. Okay, so indeed, the removal of self-ownership in the telling of a narrative, a negative past, is often seen in psychological studies on the self-perception of criminal offenders as processes of neutralization and shame deflection. As interpreted by Schecthman, desisting offenders would frequently construct their past in a manner that rationalizes or justifies their deviation from social norms. When telling their story, desisting offenders would often interpret their narrative in such a way as to maintain a measure of self-respect in the face of overwhelming shame. Narrative self-conceptions become tools used to reflect one's own personal gaze and disapproval of others. Personal accountability is mitigated by viewing the self as more acted upon than acting. Offenders, in telling their story, use linguistic strategies that distance themselves from their criminal actions. Past episodes were described as it happening, not that I did something. Specific episodes, however brief, were made central and were seen to reveal a core self amidst all the negative aspects and criminality of one's life. They would argue, even when they were at their worst, desisting narrative emphasized that deep down they were still good people. It was someone else, not me, who committed those negative offenses. So, this sense of protection gained by placing the negative past into a person narrative may insulate the self from shame, yet it seems to contradict some of the central tenets of rehabilitative processes of owning up and self-incrimination, that place owning up and self-incrimination as central. Within traditional corrective methods, such neutralizations are seen as a kind of excuse. Correctional programming often places an emphasis on the need for criminals to accept responsibility and stop making excuses. In an effort to force the offender to confront the past, he or she is stripped of neutralizing techniques and made to confront, accept, and own the offending act without recourse to rationalization when telling a personal history. So, through confession and little tolerance for excuses, treatment focuses on unmasking offenders, tearing down their well-developed defense mechanisms, and shining the mirror of reality at them, confronting with the shame of their lives. The idea is that they need to put the offender in a position to take responsibility for a past and to see it as one's own and feel the shame that they know is theirs. What is important from this perspective is that they need to understand the past not just as something that's happened, but something that reflects the current self. In this sense, the separation between persons and selves becomes another form of neutralization of a troublesome past. If a criminal regretted his past actions, in a case of such a regret, we want them to see the action as theirs and not just tacitly acknowledged. The person might say, that is not me anymore, but it's a further question of whether this is the correct attitude to take towards one's past, where owning the past seems to be procedurally and morally obligatory. Okay, so at this point, within Schecthman's account of subtle survival and empathic access, ceasing to own one's past seems to diminish William's sense of taking responsibility for it. If I lack self-ownership for my past, where the past is seen as something I must necessarily purge, can it be said that I accept full responsibility for those actions? Okay. Without self-ownership, can the resulting discontinuous self truly inhabit the regret, sense of duty, or obligation that is associated with responsibility? At this point, however, Schecthman could respond that because the narrative is a lens through which we filter our experience and plan our actions, it should not be confused with how we think of ourselves in our reflective hours. Namely, even if we acknowledge that one should view their past as involving the self, this does not change the fact that the reformed offender, or even the mortified matron, when lacking empathic access, approaches the world in a very different manner than she did before. Thus, distinguishing how offenders should view their past may be peripheral to what it means to have a narrative. This response, however, assumes that the repudiated and shameful past is not influential and lacks consideration in the present. I would argue that this is not the case. The fact that the mortified matron feels shame at all indicates that a repudiated past is more connected to the self than Schecthman initially supposes. A repudiated past is not wholly unlike the ordinary maturation that allows for persistence of the self in Schecthman's terms. Okay, so sometimes we are unaffected by the past when certain events are seen as too insignificant to warrant much concern in the present. There are parts of our past where we pay very little attention to and are otherwise completely indifferent. When aspects of our lives carry no import, effect, or even meaning for ourselves in the present, maybe Schecthman's entitled to a division. And yet, even if we grant this indifference to be the mechanism of non-survivable change, this does not speak to cases of negatively viewed past causing profound shame. The sense in which the mortified matron is a new self makes it difficult to explain why she feels these extremes of emotion at all. So one thing I want to ask is, can we really be embarrassed to the point of mortification for actions that are only tacitly acknowledged? Okay. So in making the distinction between persons and selves, Schecthman acknowledges a natural reluctance to confront truths in our past due to the psychological pain that they may cause. For most desisting offenders, it is often too difficult to embrace the past as one's own when reviewing the past leads to distress, mental suffering, shame, remorse, and regret. Yet the pain caused by the mere contemplation of past wrongdoing says more about who the individual is than they may wish to accept. As noted by Jeffrey Bluestein, an offender feels pain because one regards one's earlier wrongdoing as relevant to an evaluation of oneself or the sort of life one has led, either in overall or in some specific area, and contemplating what one has done is painful in part because it occasions a negative self-evaluation. While it is true that one can feel shame over one's country, family, or occupation, one cannot escape the shame of the past through distance or a change in vocation. The shamed person has not only lost social esteem, but also self-esteem. As Bernard Williams states, shame looks at what I am. The shamed person in this sense is split between the identity his sense of value is predicated on and the past action that disconfirms that identity. What is important, however, is the split is felt because actions, whether past or present, are conceived as one's own. The past is not simply something that happened, but something which I'm deeply implicated. The effect and influence is still there, alongside the acknowledgement that such aspects are relevant to who I am now. The fact that shame is felt because former desires and motives now come into conflict with an expanded set of normative considerations. Both of these are going to be considered part of the self. There's just conflict and tension. So, the mortified matron may weigh former considerations in a different manner, but this is not wholly different from the less serious matron, who can be considered the same self through maturation and expansion. A repudiated past could signal the same sort of expansion, even if that expansion includes considerations that are in tension with former desires.
Thank you.
Yeah, 5 minutes? Okay. Probably. Okay, I'm going to try to, yeah, I don't have too much left. So, to this extent, Schecthman emphasized the coherence of selves through the neglect of experiences negatively viewed, but nevertheless deeply held. If the past has the ability to inflect the present and position as something which one is deeply implicated, the distinction between negative and positively viewed past becomes rather arbitrary. In making her empathic division, Schecthman implicitly narrows what can and cannot be considered part of the self, due to the exclusion of the narrative containing shame and internal conflict. So what has actually been excluded here? So an offender may need to see himself in a manner that allows him to process the negative aspects alongside the good. I argue that to achieve this doesn't necessarily mean compartmentalizing former actions to conceive of a new self, but to reconceptualize and correct a past in a manner that allows for a generative story. A negative past can be made a necessary prelude to productive life. According to David Feldman, lives in this sense can be understood through an exchange of meaning. Velman states an edifying misfortune is not just offset but redeemed by being given a meaningful place through the progress of one's life. Here we're given two options. We consider the past a dead loss, or we conceive it as a foundation for future action. As Schecthman positions the mortified matron, we can limit our self-narrative at the point where former desires and objectives have changed. On this approach, the past is perceived as a failure to be purged. However, as Velman suggests, there is value in engaging this revisionary process. Moments in our lives are not discarded but given foundational value. Whether or not the past is evaluated positively or negatively, it can remain a constitutive basis for future deliberation. Essentially, because I am the person I am, I ought to do X rather than Y. For cases of rehabilitation, the belief that past actions were wrong informs multiple aspects of one's individual life as he or she continually strives to act against them. One may not fully accept or empathize with the past, but nonetheless sees it as one's own and feels the effects and carries it as part of the self. So, where does this actually leave us? I think I went there. If we conceive of the self as including these negative aspects, radical breaks with portions of my past are not necessarily because I evaluate them differently. Indeed, in case of reform, we may be dealing with a different subject of experience, given by the very different way we approach the world. Yet it is the effect that sustains us. If it's the effect that sustains the self, there's little reason to exclude a negative past. With concern present in the case of loss of empathic access, it no longer carries much weight on whether or not the person can be legitimately characterized as the same. In an unforeseen consequence, Schecthman reduces empathy into a vague notion of continuing objectives. But surely, the continuing self should not primarily rest on the degree in which I pursue my former desires. Like ordinary maturation, the self can persist once the negative self-evaluation is understood as a means of expanding the self, rather than limiting it. However, in taking the negative self-evaluation as part of the self, does this mean we must be forever filled with shame and regret? Wallowing in a shameful past can easily lead to self-indulgence and sometimes profound depression. But negative self-evaluations need not to be essentially egoistic or destructive. One may still shudder at the pangs of intense shame at actions long since past, but these emotions are mitigated by the acknowledgement that although we may regret our past, It is that past that made us who we are today. As Vellman argued, there's a greater value in revising one's past, and in redeeming the past, it is still kept as our own. With this concept of self-extension, we can make sense of the alcoholic's claim, who after years without a drink would still consider himself an alcoholic. What may at first seem as metaphorical is understood as a more substantial claim. For the rehabilitated criminal, his past actions remain present despite temporal distance and inform his perspective in how he approaches the world. If we were to have a notion of rehabilitation that includes taking responsibility in the manner I've outlined, the self should persist despite reformation. When confronted with a negative past, we may disagree with what was done and fiercely repudiate our actions, motives, and desires. But in such negative self-evaluations, we form who we are in the present. So a hated past is still our own past.
Great, thanks, Nikki. Now we have maybe a question period, so anyone? Frederick?
It seems that shame is something of a self-inflicted sentiment that's lived socially.
Mm-hmm.
So you have like feedbacks from other people that
Yeah.
make you ashamed of yourself. So in the case of a reasonably matured person who's come about her past and who's come to view the past with her wrongdoings as something she actually did, but she owns them now,
Mm-hmm.
and she makes the work on herself to eventually, I guess, empower herself and whatever. But what if all the feedback she gets from other people is the negative effects of whatever wrongdoings she does? And I think empirically that's what happens when you get a person that rehabilitated criminal won't necessarily have the chance to live a full-fledged life as a free self because other people won't accept his rehabilitation. So how do we account for that social relationships?
I'm not sure how we would account for the social relationship in particular, because that's a different question that it may be very difficult. But would it be better for them to say, that wasn't me, that was somebody else? Or would it be better for them to actually say, this is something I am, I understand that's the way it was, and I'm going to show you I'm going to be somebody different. And they can use that shame as something. And something that happened in their past, and they can use that to almost disprove what other people are saying with that shameful past. And what I was just basically trying to say is that if we want to relegate and just say that wasn't me anymore, then we've lost responsibility for it in that sense. So I'm not really sure how, I didn't really think about it in that social aspect, but maybe in that sense they could use that social aspect as a way to show that I am a different person now, if that makes sense.
But
I'm not sure if I answered it.
no, it's a reasonable answer. But I mean, sometimes denying the past might be a relevant strategy.
Yeah.
For the person to actually continue living his life. That's
Yeah.
I guess your point is saying that she wouldn't live her life if she denied her past.
Well, I think she can still live her life, but she just wouldn't take responsibility for it. Because a lot of people, even the one person I was quoting when talking about neutralization, she will actually argue that to take responsibility of the past is going to give the rehabilitated offender quite a bit of shame. It's very, very difficult for them to carry forward. And sometimes it may be adaptive to take on this sort of perspective. But in that same sort of sense, it may be adaptive, but we can also lead the person back to it, maybe when they're strong enough to actually take on that past. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that answers it as well. But.
Okay.
Eric?
So, I guess maybe this isn't such a question, but it's kind of riffing on what Frederick was going on was, I think one thing that would be interesting to think about here too, and is that there's a way maybe to split the difference, so that we can say too that, or allow in some way that people can take responsibility for our actions, but also that we recognize that it's important that we have mechanisms in society for people who do have negative pasts to actually put blame on that too. I mean, I think that's actually like an important part of government, for instance, or whatever, or like society, is that they absorb blame for lots of things that, like, we don't know who else to blame. It's really, society's really complicated. It's like, well, that's what they do, they kind of sort. So it seems to me like that kind of splits the difference in a way from just saying, well, that wasn't me or that's a different person. It's that we can do that, but also not necessarily force it that we expect everybody to take full responsibility for everything they've done and like deal with all the ramifications.
Yeah.
So we can say that there's like, I don't know, so maybe that's something to think about too, I don't know.
I think that's definitely right, because I don't think we need to take responsibility for everything that's actually happened to us, but there are certain things that, one thing when I was just writing up this little presentation, I kept on thinking of Breaking Bad, in a sense. Because when you think of Walter White, when I'm talking about taking responsibility, he goes throughout the entire time and saying, I'm doing this because I need to for my family. These forces have told me this is why I'm doing it. It's not because of it. And whether or not you like Skylar, no spoilers, but near the end, he finally comes up to her and says, I did that. I was doing it because of me. And in that sense, he took responsibility for it. So yes, I think there are some things that can be external, but it seems that when Schecthman has this, it's almost made as a good thing to make most of it external, even what I'm ashamed of that I see as my own. So yeah, I hope I didn't spoil it for anybody. I didn't tell the ending, but he does talk to me.
I really like this presentation. I thought it's really cool because it's super fertile and applicable to so many other cool things. Like, I'm a political philosopher, so I just thought of like histories of nations, right? So I know Kristeva, Gadamer, and Freud, and Waldron has done it terribly, I think. So this is a great sort of maybe new way of thinking of like a nation confronts its trauma in its history, like Germany and the Holocaust, USA and slavery, our treatment of the natives, etc. Right? And this could be like really cool application to that.
Definitely, and you can think of group persons, and maybe we can have some same sort of analog extended to actually societies as well.
Have you read something about, let's say, shame and that type of thing with situations of divorce, separation, especially love life and parenthood, where children are neglected when they separate, and then a whole life after that, there may be some guilt or whatever. So is there any relevance there?
I think in those cases it might be, again, with a kind of shame that I think we can make a distinction when somebody should have that sort of shame and when it is actually connected to their own actions. I think we wouldn't want to tell the child that that's your shame that you need to carry on with as yourself for something the parents have done, but more that shame that for your own personal actions and for your own personal choices. So I'm not sure if that gets to it. But I just started looking at this concept of shame, and I do actually want to look into it a little further because I think there's quite a wide literature on it. So I still need to further explore that.
It's really quick, just kind of like pulling things, saying like there's some really interesting applications. Like it's political, but on the individual level, when you're thinking about like dealing with like oppressive work or like dealing with issues of racism, coming through that and taking knowledge for your actions and not just staying through it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, because that definitely, even with racism and just like what can you actually relegate to your person? Should your race, should your gender be in a person history, or should it be something that you have to take on with you?
Exactly.
And I would just say that you don't necessarily need to identify any of those, but maybe Schecthman's distinction between person and selves may help try to say how you can carry that with you without necessarily identifying with it, unless you want to, and that's part of yourself. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to second Mohammed's point. I mean, I was thinking exactly the same thing, you know, that the two issues that you've raised to do with the metaphysics of identity on the one hand and the notion of responsibility on the other, and how you kind of mediate between those two with the narrative conception. That could really be, you could have a nice application of that to group identity and the tendency to distance yourself from what, you know,
And hiding a past.
yeah, your
Atrocity.
nation did in the past. I mean, it could, going back to the previous comments of Frederick and Eric, I mean, it could be a good strategy to distance yourself, but what you're suggesting is it's not actually the moral thing to do.
Yeah.
And that seems very clear in the case of our responsibility as a nation for past injustice to Indigenous people or whoever. So anyway, I just
Yeah, it
wanted
may
to-
be easier for
yeah.
us, like, to continue with, like, Canada, this is who we are, we're the multicultural system. Just let's not look over at residential schools and things like that.
Well, I mean, the argument,
Yeah.
I mean, the response is, well, we didn't do it, they did it, you know,
Yeah.
whenever it was.
Mhm.
Pardon, sorry?
And that nothing's happening now, that there is.
Yeah,
more going
yeah,
on.
that's
Yeah.
right, yeah, so.
And we should actually taking those sorts of experience, if we want to consider the nation to have an identity as itself, that might in itself be a bigger question.
You know, that is, but I wondered if you could do something
Yeah.
with narrative identity there, but then also, given how you've connected them up, sort of solve that problem at the same time. It'd be quite interesting to pursue that.
And tell Canada to have its identity with
Yeah,
accepting
exactly, yeah,
responsibility for what it's
exactly,
done.
yeah. Mm.
Any more questions for Nikki? Great, well, thank you very much.